So, one of the constant things about that continuously comes up about Brexit is this lusting after old empire and myths that we constantly tell ourselves in this country. Now, we've covered this many times. In fact, one of my most commented on videos is on this very thing, and this comes from the American New Statesman, and it's Myths from a Small Island: The Dangers of a Buccaneering View of British History. The idea of global Britain ignores the reality of our imperial past and pretends that the UK can become a trading superpower through optimism alone. Sound familiar? Oh. As Brexit has blazed through British public life, torching our constitution, party system, economic ties, and diplomatic relationships, its appetite has been fed by a combustible mix of loss, betrayal, and dispossession. These are not just powerful political emotions, they rely on claims about the past that carry extraordinary destructive power. All sides in the Brexit debate trade assertions about British history, that we were lied to in the referendums of 75 or 2016, that we stood alone in World War II, and that we can do so again, or that no one voted to be poor when they voted to leave the EU. These are not merely the sparks tossed out by a political conflagration. They are the dry tinder on which that conflagration feeds. History is a politically powerful tool because it serves as a proxy for ideology. From Boris Johnson to Jacob Rees-Mogg, and from Dominic Raab to Liam Fox, leavers use the past to imagine the future. They make historical-based claims about Britain's natural allies, markets, or place in the world, based on curated memories of war and empire. They invoke the achievements of former generations as a model for the present, and in doing so, give the false assurance that the path down which we are walking leads to old and familiar places. As so often, history becomes the mask worn by ideology, which it wants to be mistaken for: experience. These histories owe less to academic writing than to what might be. The so-called second-hand dealers in the past, politicians, newspaper columnists, media commentators, who rummage through the scrapyard of history, pulling out the most useful parts and welding them together into a vehicle for their ambitions. The products are then marketed to the public through the most dangerous word in popular history: we. We won the war. We survived the Blitz. We abolished slavery. It's a word that allows us to pin other people's medals to our chest, to demand gratitude for other people's sacrifices, and to boast of victories bought with other people's blood. It creates a false equivalence between the past and the present in a way that can dull our sensitivity to change. Since the EU referendum in 2016, one vision of the past has become especially potent: the idea of global Britain. This is more than just a slogan, more than even than a programme of our future. It is a story about British history that makes the past a model for the present. In Jacob Rees-Mogg's telling, our history is our global nation. Yet the ship of state has been moored in a harbour since 1973. Once Brexit has been achieved, Britain can once again take to the high seas and look at the world with a world rather than the narrow European sphere. Critics often view this as imperial nostalgia, yet the reality is more serious. Nostalgia at least begins from a sense of rapture, a recognition that allows that something has been left behind, to which we can return only in the imagination. By contrast, the core idea of global Britain is that nothing has changed, that Britain can enjoy the same power as it had in its colonial heyday. Far from the lucrating in empire, Brexiteers have actively evaded the topic, for to do so would otherwise force them to engage with the significance of its loss. The story they tell is not of a great empire that no longer exists, required to cut its cloth differently for a post-colonial age, but of a small island that has always punched above its weight, a swashbuckling, buccaneering people valiantly weighing out against the odds. It is the myth of smallness, not the myth of empire, that defines global Britain, and that teaches is such dangerous lessons for the future. The godfather of Brexit history, at least for the British right, was Enoch Powell. Powell was an early proponent of the idea that all history is a myth, not in the sense that it was untrue, but it was the stories that were told about the past that carried the greatest political meanings. The greatest task of the statesman, he believed, was to offer his people good myths and to save them from harmful myths. Whether those stories were strictly accurate matters less than the political charge they carried and the programs to which they give their support. For Powell, post-war Britain was in the grip of an especially pernicious myth, which he called the myth of empire. This was the belief that Britain was once great because she had an empire, but was now small and weak because she had one no longer. That myth, he argued, grotesquely overstated both the importance of empire itself and the effect of Britain of its loss. The conviction that Britain was powerful because of her empire, or that its power had been sustained by colonies and dependencies, which were in fact a net burden, had caused great psychological damage. Its legacy was evident in two contradictory tendencies. One, a pervasive sense of decline that had sapped the British of self-confidence. The other, the longing for empire, and the substitutes such as the Commonwealth or the European Community. Powell called this the demon of gigantism, the idea that Britain must submerge its nationhood to some larger entity in the pursuit of global power. Powell came not to praise the empire, but to bury it, and his heirs would take up the shovel with zest. The empire would be written out of Britain's island story, and in particular from the memory of the Second World War. With a few short years, the colonial ex-servicemen who had fought for Britain would be cast as invaders themselves in the fervile rhetoric of Powell and his acolytes. Yet, the story was to take a turn that Powell had not anticipated. For a while, Powell had sought to slay the demon of gigantism, calling the British people home again from years of distant wandering. His inheritors would send Britain back out into the world to recapture the glories of the past. They would do so armed with a view of British history that decoupled the achievements of the imperial age from the imperial structures that made them possible. The effect was to teach a dangerous lesson, that renewed greatness was there for the taking, requiring little more than pluck, optimism, and a can-do attitude. In the aftermath of the 2016 referendum, a series of commentators held up Britain's global past as an inspiration for the present. Yet they did so in a curious manner. Empire barely featured in their remarks. Pushed aside by his history, centering on trade and innovation, the result was a heroic version of British history that was global but not imperial. It recast the coercive military empire as a champion of free trade, and in so doing established imperialism rather than empire as a golden thread connecting the past and present. That made it possible for one to disclaim empire and to invoke the lessons of the imperial past. In Johnson's words, the challenge was to rediscover some of the dynamism of those bearded Victorians, not to build a new empire, heaven forfend, but to go back out into the world in a way that we have perhaps forgotten. This was particularly striking in the rhetoric of Liam Fox, the International Trade Secretary from 2016 to 19, who was a big cheerleader for global Britain. At a speech in Manchester in 2016, he told business leaders that the global influence Britain enjoys today is largely down to our proud trading history. A small island perched on the edge of Europe had become the world's largest and most powerful trading nation, not through its military or naval power, but through a history steeped in innovation and endeavour. In 2017, he extended that analysis more broadly. In an address to the Conference of the Commonwealth Trade Ministers, the very existence of this event, the first of its kind, was a mark of importance Fox placed upon the Commonwealth, which he described as an association of some of the world's oldest and most resilient friendships. Yet he seemed remarkably coy about the nature of those friendships. In what passed as a historic selection of his speech, Fox made the remarkable suggestion that what bound the Commonwealth together was a shared history of free trade. Britain, he proclaimed, had long been associated with both the concept of practice of free trade. A small island perched on the edge of the European continent became a leader for world trade. For a century, the terms Britain and free trade were pretty much synonymous. For those of us represented here today, we have, through our shared history and experience, witnessed the transformation that trade can bring. At that same event, Priti Patel, the International Development Secretary, hailed the Commonwealth as an exemplar for free markets, private enterprise and liberal economies. Like Fox, she offered a curiously dehistorialized version of the organisation, bound together not by a common experience of empire, but by a shared commitment to market capitalism. This was a history that was exceeded even Powell's ambitions, a history not just of Britain, but of the Commonwealth, from which the empire was politely excised. The use of trade as a euphemism for empire has become a staple of Brexit ideology. Grant Staples, for example, wrote an article in the week after the referendum urging Britain to retake its former status as the world's greatest trading nation. The way to do this, it transpired, was not to conquer India or to build the world's largest navy, but to rediscover the swashbuckling spirit of the 19th century, when we practically owned the concept of free trade. A similar vision inspired successive Brexit secretaries. David Davis told the makers of the 2016 pro-Leave documentary, Brexit the Movie, that our history is trading buccaneering history. Back to Drake and beyond, that is what we're good at. Dominic Raab, likewise, has urged the British to resume their historic role as buccaneering free traders. Such rhetoric showed no understanding of the role that empire actually played in Britain's trading history, in breaking open new markets, protecting the sea lanes and enforcing British commercial superiority. Instead, it rested on a vague appeal to swashbuckling spirit, resonating of a plucky little Britain's singeing their beards of the mighty powers. Talks of Francis Drake evoked an Elizabethan ideal of pirates, privateers and daring do, but not the gunboats and the battleships of the high Victorian age. In doing so, it suppressed the scale of British power in the past to facilitate the comparison with the present. What such histories have in common is not the celebration of empire, but its assurance from historical record that forgetting fulfills two important functions in Brexit ideology. First, it establishes a continuity between the past and present, that it is uninterrupted by the loss of Britain's colonies. It creates a usable history of British greatness, anchored not by varnished imperial structures, but set in a timeless national characteristics that require only liberation from Brussels to burst forth once more into bloom. As such, it rejects the importance of decolonisation as a rapture, and one might require a recasting of Britain's geopolitical ambitions, or more, bounded by regional identity. Second, enables the synthesis between two visions of British history, one that might otherwise seem at odds, and one that casts Britain as a global titan, the other that views it as a small island punching above its weight in the world and treats the empire as something Britain did, not as something that Britain was and is no longer. It reimagines imperial history as an achievement against odds. The story, as David Cameron put it in 2011, of a small country doing great things. It casts the smallness as an essential ingredient in Britain's historical success, not as a condition to which Britain has been reduced to by the withdrawing of its imperial tide. That idea of smallness, even at the peak of Britain's imperial power, has deep roots in British folk memory. It is the story of Francis Drake standing heroically against the mighty Spanish Empire, of Robert Baden-Powell bravely holding off the Boers at Murfakang, and of the fishing smackerels and pleasure boats that defied the Nazis' war machine at Dunkirk. In the most famous cartoon of the Second World War, the lone warrior stands on the British coast with his fist clenched in defiance as the skies blacken beneath the shadows of the Luftwaffe. In the high days of empire, such memories are useful dishonesty. They allowed a military superpower to imagine itself as an embattled champion of freedom, engaging in historical resistance against forces that willed its destruction. During the two world wars, when defeat was indeed a possibility, they served to bolster morale. Today, by contrast, they are put to more dangerous ends. They invoke a glorious past as a model for the future, while wiping from popular memory everything that made Britain such a formidable power. The story that celebrates smallness, that tells of glorious victories against impossible odds, has little room for Britain's colossal military machine, unmatched economic power, and global empire, whose contribution to the war effort has shamefully been forgotten. This has at least three distinctive consequences. It detaches memories of British greatness from material conditions that made it possible. It overstates what Britain can achieve in the world as a small nation, standing alone, and it exaggerates the power of positive thinking as a national strategy. Failure can be blamed on those who refuse to cheer on doormats and pessimists and saboteurs who simply refuse to believe with sufficient fervour. What brings us to Boris Johnson, however, was that he differs from some of his fellow leavers in that he is an unabashed enthusiast for empire. In a notorious article on Africa in 2002, he wrote that the problem is not that we were once in charge, but we are not in charge any longer. His 2014 biography of Winston Churchill, The Churchill Factor, challenges those who despise the empire to decide whether they hate it more than slavery or female genital mutilation. As if the British had stumbled upon a crime scene and generously stamped out it to help there. Sorry. So as if the British had simply stumbled upon a crime scene and graciously stayed around to help. Yet Johnson has never showed the slightest regret at the empire's passing, or the sense that Britain is weakened by its loss. At the Conservative Party conference in 2016, he called the end of empire a profoundly good thing, but segued into a tub-thumping celebration of the 20th century Britain as a soft power superpower. Even on the seas, he boasted, British ships were tackling pirates with all the courage and defensiveness of our 19th century forebears. Those tempered to our despair about Brexit were invited to learn from the pessimist who had predicted the worst, who were unbounded by the British Empire. The empire stands in Johnson's rhetoric as a mark of virility, evidence of what Britain could still achieve if it put some lead in its collective pencil. Launching the Leave campaign in 2016, Johnson reminded voters that we used to run the biggest empire the world has ever seen, and with a much smaller domestic population. Are we really unable to do trade deals? Strikingly, we is assumed to be the same as such in the case mentioned above, a domestic population that is larger today than at the peak of empire. In Johnson's rhetoric, Britain had an empire because it was mighty. It was not because it had an empire. That power is assumed to have rested on material underpinnings on on a cocktail of a pluck, courage, and determination, encapsulated in a heroic leader. For a nation to be great, it appears, it is necessary that it wills it. It is no surprise, then, that for Johnson, of the exemplary episode of the British history is the Second World War. In the Churchill factor, he counts the British victory in strikingly pathological terms, centering on the mobilisation of national belief in a single heroic individual. Johnson sees in Churchill, and by extension himself, a resounding human rebuttal to the fashionable euphemisms on deep economic forces, technological advances, mundane human actions, and the story of Winston Churchill. He concludes it is a pretty weathering report on all that malarkey. It is an insult to Churchill to find this a dangerous, immature vision. In the event of a no-deal Brexit, it will be that malarkey that determines whether trade seizes up, whether medicines are available, and whether ports continue to function. It was that malarkey, in the form of years of careful planning, that made a successful D-Day landings in 1944, 2 years after a swashbuckling, buccaneering trial run sent men of equal pluck and determination to be slaughtered on the beaches of Drippy. Had Boris Johnson paid more attention in his classics degree, he would be familiar with the notion of hubris, the arrogance that brings a nemesis in its wake, the rhetoric of global Britain with its breezy insistence that a nation stripped of its colonies, its military power, and its dominance of the global financial system can enjoy the same power today as at its colonial zenith. And it has set Britain on a dangerous collision course with reality. Nemesis will surely follow in that wake. What have we been saying all this time about how the longing for empire and its loss, to some of these people, the empire never went away. It's just a thing on a shelf that they can just decide to bring out. And he's completely 100% right. Without the military, the dominance of the sea lanes provided by the Royal Navy, dominance of the economic trade at the time provided by the economic navy, our military. There was a reason we were the only professional soldieries at that time, pretty much in the world. Everyone else had a conscription military. We were solely, professional soldiers, because we constantly needed soldiers around the world to suppress those damn colonials. That's a fact. And this is history that people forget. We weren't great, because of empire. We were great because we had an empire. Emphasis on the had. We do not have that now. None of these nations are rushing to embrace us in this brotherly embrace that they claim. At that conference that was Liam Fox was mentioned at, India stood up and said, "We will not be used as an imperial bazaar." And as such, this dangerous myth that the British Empire was somehow this really great thing continues today in the British psyche, and has damaged it to such an extent that people like Johnson can somehow believe that, yeah, we'll do it. A can-do attitude will somehow see us through. That's not what happened at all. Again, look at what Johnson mentions of Winston Churchill. Any military historian will tell you, or expert in that time will tell you, planning was constantly going on, all the time. Didn't always work, but it was your planning that you needed, because some of those plans included what to do if it failed. And that is something that our government seems completely unwilling to accept, that Brexit has failed. It was always a failed project, built on lies and a longing for a imperial past that could never come back.